This video is on the H&K LEM trigger and why I prefer it over something like a Glock striker action or a double action only, or a double action single action for that matter. Anyway, number one, all of these guns are clear and they're pointed in a safe direction. There's no ammo anywhere around here. So what is the LEM trigger? It's actually closer to a double action single action than anything else. It actually shares a lot of the same internal components. This particular gun has a mainspring right here. It has a standard trigger and a hammer, just like all of the other hammer trigger guns. Now, H&K's LEM system is proprietary to H&K, and they make it on their USP line of pistols, their P2000, HK45, and P30 line of pistols, and I like it a lot. The acorn's falling, so we got to keep an eye out. Anyway, what is it? So this is in its cocked state. It acts like a single action trigger, but it has a hammer that gets pulled back when you put a little bit of force on the trigger. So it gets pulled all the way to a defined wall, and then it fires. Then the gun will cycle. You will have a reset, which will happen about here, and then you have another shot of the trigger. The reset I've noticed on this pistol is not as good as something like a DASA, or for that matter a striker action like a Glock, but it's pretty good. Not really going to be able to see this other than the fact that I do it, but the trigger pull, the brake, this was at 4 3/4 pounds right here. So even with the take up, you have a very light or relatively light trigger pull, just like a single action. Now, if you do, unlike a striker fire, if you do have a misfire or a light primer strike, you can fire the gun again. Now the hammer is in its fully forward state, which it normally is not here. And the mainspring inside this gun is decocked. So you'll only come to this point if you've landed the hammer and nothing has happened. So here you can pull, and it's like it's over my trigger pounds gauge. It's like a 12-pound pull, thereabouts. I actually converted this H&K from a DASA mode to an LEM mode by buying the USP components off HK Parts. I took the USP components, and there's just like a spring or two that you don't have to use. You use the stock springs, and you get a variant 1 LEM. I also have a variant 2 LEM in another pistol, the P2000 SK, great gun. I'll do a video on that later. But I want to compare it to a very similar pistol, although it's a little different. This is the double action, single action USP compact in 9mm. This gun, if you're here, you have your same double action pull. The gun will cycle, and you have a single action trigger. This single action trigger is essentially feels the same as the LEM. Now if I cock it back, let's do the trigger test on here. There. So that is 5 pounds on the nose. I can tell you the only reason the 45 has a slightly lighter trigger is because it's slightly better worked in. Just for a bit of comparison, this is a Glock 19. This is probably the most common striker fire pistol you're going to find. This gun has the only safeties in the dongle. It's got a single action trigger, and it has a striker. For here, you have to depress a little trigger doohickey. We reset, and it's a little hard to do with this trigger gauge, so I'm going to have to put my finger in there too, there, and then kind of pull. Now this gun is a totally stock Glock 19 factory Gen 3, broke at 7 pounds. This is a relatively heavy trigger. Most people say the Glock 19 breaks around 5.5. I've actually never found that to be true unless I put aftermarket components in there. But all of that considered, the easiest gun that I have to shoot is the 45. What's nice about the 45C is that if I'm going to holster, despite the very light trigger here, if I'm going to holster, I can put my finger on the back of the hammer here, and I can't move the trigger back at all. Like I'm pushing really hard, and it's not going back. So when I go to holster, it's totally safe. When I reach up, it's essentially in its cocked mode, even though the hammer's all the way back, and I have an additional safety of having to move the trigger all the way back before I get to that break point. So this is the 45C and variant 1 LEM. This was converted from a model with the safety on one side and the double action, single action. It also had a decocker in there as well. So this pistol has a relatively light pull. This is like a pound maybe. You get to a defined wall right here, and you can really easily get to here without shooting the gun off, as long as you know your trigger. Then you feel that wall, press back a little bit, add a little more pressure. It's about 4.5 pounds. Gun fires. Slide cycles. Your reset will look like this. Right there. It's a little longer than some double action, single actions. Let me try that again because the reset didn't quite happen all the way. I was trying too hard to get this thing in frame. Right there. There's a little, it's like a slight false reset right there, right before the full reset. If you're shooting, I've never noticed that. I only notice it when I'm being very particular about finding that exact reset point. Just for a comparison, you can see the hammer only has to move back a little bit with this last bit of trigger travel. And then if you release it, it goes back. And here, if you put your finger on the trigger and go all the way back to that wall, it is the exact same feeling as right here if you reset and then go back to the wall. So in that sense, it's just like a Glock 19. Speaking of which, this is a Glock 19. This has the striker fire, so just like this, you pull back on the trigger, you get to a defined wall, add a little more pressure, the gun fires. Gun resets. It's a slightly better reset than the 45C. As far as tactility, it doesn't have any kind of false clicks or anything. And then you fire again. You're pretty much right on that wall once it resets. Unlike the 45, you have a little bit of take up. This is a really good gun. But I don't like the lack of a hammer. Some people do like that. They like not having stuff in here that can have an issue. What I don't like about this is I have to be more careful when I holster this. Obviously, the trigger is heavier on here than on the 45, but on the 45 I can put my finger on the back of the hammer, and I can't move that trigger back as long as my finger is firmly on that hammer. Just as a point of reference, here's the USB compact. This is in double action mode. For here, you start feeling pressure, and you have to continue all the way to about here, and then the trigger breaks. H&Ks and Walthers break way at the back of the trigger guard, which I kind of like. After you have that break, the slide cycles, now you're in single action mode. Trigger goes to here. Again, it's about the same distance as on the 45C, and you have a little bit more take up, and the gun fires. And from here on out, you're in single action mode. Now, if you're out of ammo, slide locks to the rear, you put more ammo in, let it go home, you're in single action mode again. This has a safety, so you can carry it cocked and locked like this if you want. And probably the biggest analog to the 45C is if you had this forget the safety, you just have this in single action mode, and then every time it cycles, it'll be in single action, unless there's a problem, and then you can do that again. The 45C, rather the LEMs, like in this 45C, they don't have external safeties. I'm okay with that. They work just fine, and there's more trigger travel than something like this. If the safety were to come off, there's more trigger travel than this quick little pop here. This trigger and the 45C, I can shoot better than the Glock, but the Glock is definitely the simpler choice if you're just going to pick one up and start shooting. But the LEM is not a bad option. Hope you enjoyed this quick impromptu video on the H&K LEM trigger. There's a couple other trigger actions out there. I know SIG has its DAC model, and there's a couple others that are kind of like faux double action, single action. Walther has its AS kind of in there as well, which I kind of like as well. But anyway, all of these are just personal preference for me, but I tend to like it. I like having that physical hammer on the back, and I find that I can shoot it a little better than I can a striker fire pistol. Stay safe, everyone. See ya.